2, and 1. Panel. In the status quo, worker cooperatives are not mandatory. Sure, some worker cooperatives might exist within certain universities or certain companies on a micro level. We, on Opening Government, want to change that. We believe inside Opening Government that worker cooperatives are the potential and gateway for the people of the world to have a better situation for themselves, their families, and it will give them far more equitable treatment for themselves and these workers rather than the world of status quo. I will give you 3 things in my speech. Number 1, define where this debate is and where it isn't. Number 2, why workers' rights are central to this debate and why OG as a consequence takes better care of them. And number 3, how the long-term benefits of a happy population will snowball into a more productive society with a thriving economy, which is essentially what this debate is wanting to be about, right? This debate is about explaining why an economy will be far better off if it will be dominated by these worker cooperatives. So, just a few key pieces of framing. In status quo, who is dominating the global market or the global economy, right? Elites, multinational corporations, and the rich. And why is that bad? We rely on the altruism and benevolence of these corporations, of these rich people, to help their workers out, to give them a fair wage, and to give them a better situation of living for themselves. And what we have seen that on a vast level of instances is that these corporations and these elites have not kept their burden of altruism, have not kept their burden of benevolence, and instead have turned towards greed, turned towards their own self-interest, which as a byproduct of that leads them to disavowing and ignoring the interests of these other workers. This can be seen in cases like contractualization, which is an example that's pertinent to this debate, and we will spend a part of my speech on later on that particular point. And I know the temptation of what I'm saying is to think, yeah, it's obvious, which is precisely why it's so disingenuous and why it's so harmful to the workers of today. Now, to clarify, what do we mean when we say dominating, or what does dominating mean in the context of this debate? Workers' cooperatives are going to be statistically larger and more in number than big businesses and individual owners. That's the first part of framing. Number 2, we want priority funding to go to these types of cooperative. We want priority funding to go to these cooperatives. Why? So that it makes it easier for people to form these worker cooperatives, and we want incentives for them to remain as an institution in the long term. And number 3, we want them to have more lobbying power, whether it be in the cooperative itself, or the business, or the overarching industry in which they are in. These are characterizations that are vital to proving how this dominance looks like in order to ground the debate. Note though, panel, that this is not a policy motion, and so we tell you that any attempt of opposition to say, oh, this isn't going to be feasible because it can't be well done, falls outside the confines of this motion. This is not our burden to prove why is this the case, and all that technicality argumentation is inherently out of the scope of this debate. The debate itself grounds it on whether or not we can actually prove that this will happen. Argument number 1. Our first argument is how domination of workers' cooperatives ensures that the workers' needs and priorities are met, and how in principle this is a means to best empower them. In status quo, a lot of times workers are seen as dispensable. They are merely a cog in this huge economic machine. This leads to issues such as contractualization scandals. We see in developing nations wherein blue-collar workers, or those working in vocational mechanical jobs such as sales clerks, janitors, waiters, etc., are at the mercy of the large multinational corporations to renew their work contract. And majority of the time, the large corporation hires a new batch of workers because they do not want to pay expensive costs in having to regularize them as employees and have to pay for things like insurance and state-mandated healthcare, etc. All those things. So they often face job insecurity and have to take on many odd and multiple jobs as they moonlight. Workers' cooperatives prevent this from happening when they have the lobbying power and actual budget to be able to push the board of directors and C-suite executives to give them higher wages and other things that they might want to lobby for. This is less likely to happen in a world where they are not dominant because in status quo, we see how there are so many failed attempts at workers' unions, clubs, and other more informal means of organizing themselves. The dominance of workers' cooperatives give them the lobbying power they need to fight for what they want. Argument number 2, unless there's a POI.
POI, yeah.
Yeah, go.
Alright, so what do you mean by lobbying power? What are they lobbying? I mean, in a workers' cooperative, there is no board of directors. So if you want to lobby someone, it's your own workplace. Please explain that.
I mean, if you want to lobby for something, assumingly it's going to be in the own self-interest of yourselves and the interest of other people, i.e. like higher wages, higher living conditions, all that sorts of things that you can lobby for, and you don't necessarily need a board of directors to do that. Really quickly, our second argument is how a dominant of workers' cooperatives in the long run improves the economic situation. Ironically enough, not paying too much attention to the margins or bottom line is actually what pushes your workers to be more productive. Your workforce is the lifeblood of your organization, and without them, you do not have a business. If you focus on their needs and wants, you better set up the businesses for long-term success when they are motivated to stay and work in your company. This benefit happens when you have a dominance of workers' cooperatives, since in status quo, there's often a lot of scandal or a lot of controversy when they form because upper management and business owners are worried about backlash, scrutiny, drama, etc. We shatter this veil of ignorance and tell you that when a world where they are dominating as the majority, over time there's less likely for taboo since this becomes something more normalized. Once workers actually have fair wages and secure working conditions, which aren't at the mercy of corporate altruism or at an industry standard, they become less likely to drop off and move around in the pursuit of certainty. This means less employment and more productivity, which trickle back to the economy and organization in the long run. All of those things are fundamentally good and fundamentally happen on our side of the house. Proud to propose. Thank you.